Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining today's webinar. My name is Eliza Parrish. I'm the Director of Alumni Engagement for the College of William & Mary, Raymond A. Mason School of Business. And as those of you who have joined us before are aware, we bring you these webinars as part of our commitment to provide you with opportunities for lifelong learning. It is my great pleasure to welcome today an alumnus of the College of William & Mary and a colleague. Susan Rucker is a seasoned executive with over 30 years of experience managing high-performance teams and growing businesses. She has served as a senior operating executive in the professional services, technology, and higher education industries, an audit and consulting partner in one of the Big Four accounting firms, and has managed businesses of over $100 million in annual revenues. She has managed domestic and global businesses, growing them through internal initiatives and acquisitions. As CFO of the Raymond A. Mason School of Business, Ms. Rucker provides information and support for the work of the Board of William & Mary Business School Foundation. In addition, she has an independent consulting business where she does executive coaching and strategic consulting for businesses. Ms. Rucker has worked in global environments, managing people in over 30 countries. A skilled communicator and facilitator, she has worked with boards and CEOs developing and implementing business strategy. She has held senior management positions at KPMG, Unisys, and Tantum LLC. In addition to managing client service delivery, Ms. Rucker has also managed information technology, recruiting, human resources, and accounting for finance functions. Apropos today's topic, Ms. Rucker has served or currently serves on numerous not-for-profit boards at an executive level. Susan, I offer it to you.
Welcome, everyone. We're delighted to have you today to talk about a topic that's actually very near and dear to my heart, which is serving on a nonprofit board. We want to know a little bit about why you signed up today. I'm assuming that part of the reason you joined us is because you want to be on a nonprofit board. So if you could take a look at this poll and fill in what would be the reason that you want to be on a nonprofit board, we'd like to see those results, and then you can actually see what your colleagues who are on the webinar are saying themselves. And so what we're saying so far, the lead is, I love the organization and I want to be on their board. So we'll give that another minute. Obviously, not-for-profits are important to all of us. We are touched by them every day. We'll talk in a few minutes about how ubiquitous they are throughout our society. So what it's saying as we look at this is, first and foremost, you do love certain organizations and want to be on their board, but you also think you can contribute. And that's great. But let's think about for a minute, and let's go ahead and end that poll. Let's think about for a minute which of those reasons is the right one to be on the board. Well, the answer is it depends. None of those reasons by themselves is the right reason to be on a board. In fact, what you really need to do is think about first why you want to be there, but then understand the role and responsibility of being on a board. And then, if the reason you want to be there fits with what you're willing to do in terms of role and responsibility, it'll be great for you to be on a board, and the board will be very lucky to have you. Regardless of why you're interested, the thing you really need to understand is that by signing up to be on a board and participating on that board, you really are helping to run a business. Yes, not-for-profits are businesses. And yes, it is the board that is responsible for the running of those businesses. So today we're going to talk a little bit about all of that. We're going to talk about what actually a nonprofit is and how it's organized. We're going to talk about the role of the board. We're going to talk about the role and responsibility of board members, and if you get asked to be on a board, what's some of the due diligence you should do before you actually accept that role. And then we're going to talk a little bit about what happens after you get on a board and some of the challenges that you may face as a board member. So let's first talk about nonprofits. Nonprofits are amazing. They provide many, many services in our community, and they contribute significantly both to our GDP and to the jobs market. If you take a look at these statistics, what you will see is that we have just over 5% of our GDP that was contributed by nonprofits in 2013. They employ between 10 and 11% of the workforce and pay almost 9% of the payroll that was paid in 2013. What you can see by those statistics is that nonprofits are generally people-to-people businesses. The business models are usually people-intensive, and they involve a lot of employees. They also touch a lot of constituents. So when you think about this, what you have to realize is that in running that business, you might be running a nonprofit that's very small and has more lower paid employees, but you might also at the nonprofit level be talking about something that is very sophisticated, has highly compensated professionals, and is quite large. Let's talk about some examples of nonprofits that would fit into these statistics. For example, you have voluntary health and welfare organizations that look out for the general welfare and benefit of the populations they serve. You have higher education. You have hospitals and other healthcare organizations. You have museums. You have foundations. There are many, many types of organizations that fit under that not-for-profit umbrella. But remember, that not-for-profit umbrella is really a corporate organization umbrella. Not-for-profits are corporations that are organized under the IRS code for public benefit. So how does that differ from for-profit corporations? In many ways, they're very much the same. They have the same governance functions, they have the same roles and responsibilities in many cases. But in a for-profit entity, the business residual assets belong to or are for the benefit of the shareholders who own the stock. In almost all nonprofits, the residual assets are not allowed to inure or be for the benefit of any individual or group of individuals. Instead, they are for the public good. And you can actually see the definition here that is in the IRS code 501c3. Now, there are certain nonprofits that actually do provide benefit to the group that they work with. For example, a homeowners association, which is under code section 501c4, is organized for the benefit of the homeowners, and they know that going in. But they also are required to provide public good in order to be able to qualify as a not-for-profit under the tax code. 2 out of 3 nonprofits in the United States actually qualify as nonprofit under the 501c3 section. And you can see the list here, which I've already talked about on a previous slide, of the way the IRS describes the types of organizations that might fit as a 501c3. You might be interested to know that there are approximately 1.2 million not-for-profit organizations in the United States. So when you start looking at that many organizations, there are a lot of board positions out there and a lot of organizations that can use your help as a board member. But remember what I said earlier, not-for-profits are corporations, and the boards are about corporate governance. The boards are responsible for running the processes that ensure legal, financial, and moral or ethical health of the organization. It is their focus to make sure that it is a healthy organization and that it is living up to the mission, vision, and values that are set forth for the organization. Let me stop here for a minute and mention that you can certainly ask questions as we go through this. Feel free to type in a question and we'll be happy to answer them as we go through the presentation. But as you can see here, the mission, vision, and values are actually what drive the board. In fact, it's a best practice to print your mission and vision on the top of your board agenda so that you can keep that in front and center of the board as they are making decisions and performing their governance duties. The board is also a collective organization. As a group, it is the board members who provide the counsel and the wise view of trying to help keep the organization moving forward and making sure it's healthy. The board actually only hires one person, which is the CEO, but the board is responsible for the overall management of the whole organization and all employees through the CEO. The board is also responsible for understanding where you've been, but more importantly, the board is responsible for thinking about the future and making sure that there's a strategy and a plan to keep the organization operating in a healthy way as you move forward. One of the other things you need to think about from a board perspective is that there are some things that only the board can do, and it is the board's responsibility to make sure that they do them. The board is the only group that can hire and evaluate the CEO. The board and the CEO partner to ensure the success of the organization. And in fact, it's critical that the board and the CEO have a relationship that's built on trust in order to have both a high-performing board and a high-performing organization. Another thing that only the board can do, if it is in fact a self-perpetuating board, is bring new members onto the board. What you will see is that in many cases, boards will actually have a matrix that they use to look at the types of members that they need to have, and they will think very carefully and deliberately about the characteristics of people who are invited to be on the board, and we'll talk more about that in a minute. The board also is the only one that has the power to take certain actions which it retains for itself. Others may be delegated to management. When the board does take action, it should be noted that the board acts as a collective body. There is no single person, no single board member that is empowered to act on behalf of the board unless they have been given that specific authority by the board itself. So I mentioned a minute ago recruiting board members. How does that happen? Well, the board needs to set some criteria for how they think about board membership. And those criteria might also be referred to as the 3 T's: time, talent, and treasure. Let's talk about each one of those individually. Time. Every board member is going to be required to give time. Time can be given in a lot of ways. Time can be given as attendance at board meetings, participation in committees, and potentially in community relations. There may be other things that board members will be asked to do. But what you need to remember is that your time as a board member is different than your time as a volunteer. When you're volunteering, you're volunteering. When you're doing board work, you're doing board work. And so you have to think about what level of effort is required by the organization and what level of effort are you willing to give. It's an important point because as a member of the governance group, if you're not there, you can't participate. And in fact, you may have been asked to be on the board for a particular reason, and they need you there to be part of the meetings. Going to pause for a minute and say we do have a question about the PowerPoints, and I believe that we will be sending out the presentation later, and the PowerPoints will be embedded in the video, and you will be able to receive that after the conclusion of the webinar. So now let's move on to treasure. Yes, you will be expected to give money. In general, boards look for 100% participation for board members to actually support the organization. This is a critical requirement for you to understand. Many boards require only small donations. Even $1 might work. However, other boards have significant monetary requirements for sitting on the boards. Some of them can be as high as 6 figures or higher. What you need to understand is not only the amount that you would be required to contribute, but also the timing. Are you required to give it at the beginning of the year, ratably throughout the year, at the end of the year? Other people who are supporting the organization will almost always look to see if board members are providing 100% leadership in terms of raising treasure for the organization. And frankly, one of my favorite sayings when we talk about not-for-profits is, no money, no mission. It is critical that you understand how the organization is funded and what role the board is playing in either providing or helping to raise the funds that are needed for organizational operations. Boards also look at talent. Specialized skills can make a real difference. You may need, for example, people who have financial backgrounds, investment backgrounds. In some cases, you may need other professions like physicians or musicians, depending upon the type of organization that you're looking at. But remember, even if you're bringing a specialized skill, you're there as a board member first and as a fill-in-the-blank second. When I serve on a board, there's no question that people are interested in the financial background and management background that I bring, but I'm there as a board member, not as a CPA. And that's something that sometimes I have to remember when I'm sitting at the board table. The size and the needs of the organization will drive both the size and mix of talents that are recruited for the board and how those talents get used. One other thing I'll mention to you, if you do have a specialized skill, but you feel that you can't commit to the time that's needed to serve on the board for everything that the board does, is you may be able to volunteer your skills on a specialized basis. It's fairly common to see a nonprofit recruit someone to serve, for example, on their investment committee who is not a full board member. But they bring that talent, they serve on that committee, and they play an invaluable role in terms of helping the organization manage the funds that they raise and steward. So, they've looked at you, they've talked about the 3 T's, and now it's important to understand the overall role of the board member after you've passed the 3 T hurdles. First of all, the board member needs to know the mission, purpose, goals, policies, and procedures of the organization. You're part of the governance. You need to understand how the organization operates, what it's trying to do, and you need to be able to think critically about whether the things it is doing are actually fulfilling its mission and vision. You need to be a full participant in fulfilling the role of the board. We've talked about that already. You can't really contribute to governance if you're not sitting at the table and bringing the skills that are the reason that you're there. You also are required to think about the numbers. Being on a board is both a right brain and a left brain activity. You can't do only one if you're going to be an effective board member. The numbers part is the part most people shy away from, but I would tell you it's actually one of the more important roles that the board plays in terms of thinking about the sustainability of the organization. Where are they getting funding? How are they using it? Do they have good thought processes on building infrastructure and being able to provide the things that the organization needs to operate effectively? And once you understand all of that, then you have to make decisions in the best interest of the organization. Sometimes that's different than the decisions that you would like to see made or the decisions that your other colleagues on the board would like to see made. And frankly, that's part of what makes being on a board interesting, is helping to think collectively about the best way to govern an organization and make sure that you can fulfill its mission. In addition to some of the responsibilities I just mentioned, you might be interested in knowing what some of the actual legal responsibilities of a board member are. If you are going to sit on a nonprofit board, I would encourage you to understand the legal climate in the state that you are located in and in the state that the organization is located in. Virginia, for example, is a very legally friendly state for not-for-profit board members. You get a lot of protection as long as you're not doing something that's fraudulent or that is clearly negligent. Otherwise, you're going to be fairly safe in terms of the actions that you take in Virginia. That's not true in other states. So what you need to do is think through what kind of liability are you willing to take on based on what's required, based on the location of both your residence and the organization. And then you also need to think through the 3 Ds. So we've got T's and D's. But the D's are the duties that board members are generally required to carry out as they go through exercising their governance responsibilities. The first one is the duty of care. The second one is the duty of loyalty. And the third one is the duty of obedience. These might be a little different than what you think by reading them at first glance. So let's dig a little deeper and talk about what they actually mean. The duty of care means that you are actually going to be careful about how you make decisions. You have to get facts, you have to ask questions, and frankly, if you get in over your head and you don't know what you need to do, you need to get expert opinions. I currently sit on several boards, and one of the boards I'm on, we are dealing with a particular issue that we are hiring an expert to come in and help us understand what our responsibilities are. It's a very interesting project. I wish I could tell you about it, but I can't. But what I will tell you is it's something that's fairly narrow and something that there's not as many people as you would think that really understand the obligations of this board. So we've had to not only think about the issue, but think about who to go get help from. You also, under a duty of care, are responsible for making sure that you understand that the organization is following the legal compliance requirements that exist, as well as thinking about risk management, internal control, and that you are making sure that there are management systems in place that will help flag issues that can then be brought up to the board level as appropriate. So that's the duty of care. The second duty is the duty of loyalty. You're required to be loyal to the organization. And once the organization decides on a direction, even if it's a direction you don't agree with, you're required to be loyal to that direction, because that's where the organization's collective governance body decided it was going to go. There are 2 other critical points on here. One of them is you need to get the confidentiality requirements strictly in your head. It's very tempting to go out and talk about what happened at the board meeting. There's always a great deal of mystique about board meetings. I always tell people most of the time they'd actually be very disappointed if they really sat in a number of board meetings. But from time to time there are things that go on, and you have to respect the confidentiality of what goes on in that board meeting. And you have to be very careful to avoid conflict of interest. Conflict of interest can be real, or it can be perceived. One of the boards I'm on requires us to actually sign a conflict of interest statement before every meeting. It has some very particular government rules and regulations around what happen in terms of defining how you might inadvertently trip over a conflict of interest. And so we actually look at that every single meeting to make sure that we are conducting ourselves in accordance with conflict of interest rules. Others will only ask you to sign something once a year or periodically. But if you have a perceived conflict, you need to be careful about that as well. You don't want to have others be misled. And in fact, we have turned down board members in the organizations I serve because of perceived conflict. And we have agreed on a mutual basis that that is the right thing to do with the board candidates. The duty of obedience is that you actually, as the board, are responsible for making sure that the organization is following the rules, regulations, and laws that they must follow. A good example of this is if you have any endowment funds, there is something called UPMIFA, or the Uniform Prudent Management of Institutional Funds Act, that is almost universal in the United States. I think there's one state that hasn't adopted that yet. You also all have IRS regulations that you have to follow. Many boards will actually ask to see the 990, where there are the tax return that the organization files. What you need to do is you need to understand what the rules are. This is a place where you may want to get an expert. And you as the board have to make sure that, again, you are putting the systems in place at the management level to help make sure that the organization is following these. So, when we get to this point, we've now thought about being a member, we've thought about the requirements, we've thought a little bit about the role, we've thought about the responsibilities. You now need to think about what really is the relationship of the board to the organization and to management. And I want to talk about this for a minute because it's really important. There's a big difference in governance and management. Ideally, board members are not involved in management. They're not involved in day-to-day decision making. They're not involved in doing day-to-day tasks. I also, however, do realize that there are some very small nonprofits out there that need that help, and board members actually provide that help. So what you have to think about as you think about the organization is, what role am I really going to play? What is the maturity and size of both the board and their management and the overall organization, and how do those things really interplay to provide a healthy ecosystem for the organization to thrive? Let's take a look at how some things might have interactions as you think about this. So if you look at this, we've got a graph, a chart here that says you can plot a new or immature board to a highly professionalized board in terms of thinking about the board itself. And you can look at an established and professionalized organization with mature management compared to a very new or a very small or a very immature organization. Age of the organization doesn't necessarily mean, by the way, that they've matured. You can still have very unsophisticated and immature organizations that have been around for a long time. The best place to be is in that upper right-hand quadrant, where you have an established and professionalized organization and you have a professionalized board. It's where you have the least risk of confusion between management and governance, and it's where the board can really add a lot of value in terms of governance and strategy and relationship with the CEO. The opposite of that is the lower left-hand quadrant. This is where you see the highest risk of confusion between management and the board. The board doesn't know or may not know how to exercise their role. There may not be management there that really understands how to manage a board. And oh yes, by the way, you do have to manage a board if you are one of the professionals or executives in that organization. I will tell you that working with nonprofit boards usually is going to take somewhere between 25 and 50% of the senior folks' time. They've got to be able to present the information to the board so that the board can make governance decisions. They have to have good relationships with board members. And you have to make sure as you're thinking about being on that board whether or not there is the appropriate staff there that can give you information. When you're in that lower left-hand quadrant, a lot of times that's not the case, and that's not necessarily a comfortable place to be as a board member. If you look at the upper left and the lower right, what you'll see here are kind of opposites. If you have a highly professionalized board with an immature organization and staff, that can actually be a fun place to be as well, because the board can provide very high value guidance and input to management. In the upper left, you can actually run into conflict. If you have a very strong organization, and particularly a strong CEO, they may have difficulty sometimes letting a new or immature board actually exercise governance. So one of the things you might want to think about when you're actually looking at the organization is trying to understand where both the organization and the board sit. And which of these quadrants do you think this particular organization / board is in, and what might that mean to you in terms of thinking about how much time and effort it would take to move the organization up into that upper right-hand quadrant, because that's one of the things a board ought to strive for. Let's assume you're there. You've been asked to be on the board. Now, what do you want to know before you sign on the dotted line? Let's take a look again and do a poll. How many of you have served on a board, have been asked but haven't accepted, or have been asked and not made a decision? Ooh, okay, so we've got a couple people. We've got a bunch of you who have already served. Okay, so you can see that we also have a number who have been asked to serve on a board and have not accepted. So this is kind of an interesting webinar for you, because hopefully it'll help you guide your decision making. We'll leave it up for about another 10 seconds. And what we can see is that the majority of you have already served on a board, but we have, again, about a quarter of you who haven't, or who have been asked but not accepted, and about 17 of you who have not made a decision yet. Okay, so let's end that poll and we'll move on. So before you go on a board, what you need to do is do some due diligence. We've already talked about in the due diligence process learning about the organization. You need to meet the people. I would highly encourage you to do a one-on-one with the CEO. Remember, we talked earlier about the need for trust. It's critical that you understand the CEO and that you are able to have good communication with the CEO, and that you're able to have a good rapport with the other board members. So make the time ahead of time to meet the people. You also need to understand the mission. If you're not passionate about it, or if you don't care about it, it's probably not good to be on the board. You want to give your time to something that matters and something that matters to you. So think about it. One of the other things that I always recommend is to ask whether or not you can see the strategic plan. That way you can understand the direction that the organization is going in, and you can think about, is that dovetailing with what you see as the future of the organization, or in fact, do you have a very different view of where the organization may be or be going? And if so, you want to think about that before you actually accept board membership. Part of the due diligence, we've already talked about understanding the expectations. So that's critical as well. The top one on this slide is probably the one that I would say people spend the least time on, and it's probably the most important. You need to understand the financial and operational stability of the organization. And what that means is that you're going to need to actually do some reading. You want to get the tax return, the IRS Form 990. You want to know if they have an audit and if there are audited financial statements that you can get a hold of. You want to get any regulatory filings. You want to find out if there's any pending lawsuits. You want to know whether or not there's a D&O policy, a directors and officers policy. You want to understand the limits on that and how it is actually written, and is it with a reputable company. Why is that important? Remember, we talked earlier about the fact that in certain states and under certain circumstances, you can actually have liability as a director for what happens in a nonprofit. You also have reputational risk. And let me talk about that for a minute. You don't want to be the person splattered across the front page of the newspaper if you have an organization that is not well run, that is not following the rules, that has financial frauds, or is going out of business in an unexpected and unplanned way. It is by doing this level of due diligence that you can begin to make sure that you feel comfortable that the organization has the appropriate management, guardrails on decision making, and the appropriate resources to go forward. Once you've done all of that, I suspect that you will actually have a board interview. The board interview may be in person or it may be by phone. And what you need to think about in preparing for it is what are the questions they're going to ask, but also you need to have questions you're going to ask. This is your time to ask those questions, because once you're on board, you can resign, but it's a little late. What you want to do is do your homework first and then be ready to roll and be excited and forward-looking as you do onboarding to the organization.
Susan, we have a question that's come in from Pratik. I hope I pronounced your name properly. It said two questions, actually. Have you found it challenging at times to balance working on a tight budget at a not-for-profit board while picking up exciting ideas for implementation at the organization? And two, any examples of when as a board member, you've had to do something to energize and motivate the people, be it board members or staff?
These are great questions. So the answer is yes to both. So let's talk for a minute about that. We'll talk in a few minutes about financial sustainability. One of the things that you have to be willing to do is to do the things you do well when you're doing them in a nonprofit environment. And that means making choices. Sunsetting programs is a lot of times the hardest thing to do, but it may be the best way to actually provide funding and opportunity for new and exciting strategic initiatives in the future. And so one of the critical questions that you have to look at when you have new ideas is everything you're doing essential? Can you redirect funding so that you can put it into this new and exciting idea if you don't have incremental assets to do it? Or if you have a new and exciting idea and you've got a tight budget, maybe what you have to do is you have to put some development effort into looking at how am I going to find funding and how am I going to find sustainable funding for putting a program in place. Remember that once you put a program in place, there's usually an ongoing requirement that you have funding for it. So yes, it's constantly a challenge. And what I would tell you is that generally nonprofits do not do a good job of cutting out things that have always been done but that may no longer be the most relevant and exciting things that their organization can do in the future. Frankly, when you cut out the old and move into the new, I will tell you that that's one of the things that I've seen done on a board that was the most energizing for a board to deal with. I'm on a board right now that has a mission that has been construed fairly narrowly. And as we're looking at it, we're all of a sudden realizing that the world is changing and that mission can be very much broader than what we're doing. And we actually are going to put in place a new strategic initiative. We're doing it through a strategic planning process, which, by the way, is going to take a year. And at the same time, during that year, we're freeing up the funding and the budget process to make sure that that's going to happen. Let me mention this interesting question about how long strategic planning should take. The CEO of this organization came to me and said, I have a role in that, in making the decision to go into strategic planning. And the CEO said, I'd like to do strategic planning, and I think we can present it in 6 months. And I said, no, I don't think so. And the person said, well, why not? We can certainly do planning in 6 months. And I said, well, you certainly can. But you can't certainly do an environmental survey and understand what your competition is doing and understand how the mission is expanding and really think about what you want to do in the future. If you do the planning in 6 months, you're going to do more of the same. If you take that 6 months to do a broad view and look at what the scope and thought process that's going on in that area is, and you bring your constituents and your employees and your board along, then you can do all the things about budgeting and implementation in the second 6 months. And sure enough, it's going to take us a year, but it is an extremely exciting time at the organization to kind of really rethink how we want to live out the mission and vision. So I hope that that has helped to answer those questions. All right. The next 3 slides I'm not going to go over because you'll have them in the final deck, but these are from an organization called Board Source. They are a questionnaire for you. You can actually go onto their website and pull this questionnaire down to kind of think about how do you make a decision about whether or not to be on a board. And excuse me, it was two of these. So you can actually go to boardsource.org and pull this down, and it's a great way for you to kind of think about whether or not you actually want to be on the board. So now you're on the board. What happens? Well, you get to sit in some meetings, you get to read some financial statements, but hopefully what you're doing is you're thinking on an ongoing basis about how to further the mission, vision, and strategy of the organization. One of the things in order to do that is to take your onboarding seriously. Being on the board as a new member can be hard, but you need to ask questions and you need to speak when you need to speak. Sometimes people come on boards and they hesitate. Am I really been around long enough to ask a question or to say something? And sure you have. You might want to think about getting a mentor. That's a great best practice when you bring on a new board member, is to have somebody who will speak with that board member and help them understand the culture of the board. You also want to think about looking at this concept that I talked earlier about organizational sustainability. This is a quote out of a book called The Sustainability Mindset, which I really like. It has some methodology in it for thinking about sustainability, and it looks at both financial and programmatic sustainability. Remember I said earlier, no money, no mission. You can have the best programs in the world, but if you are not financially sustainable, the organization will not survive. And so you have to think about how do you do both at the same time. And by the way, look at that last sentence. Programmatic sustainability is the ability to develop, mature, and cycle out programs to be responsive to constituencies over time. We'll look at a case study in a minute where the mission of an organization totally changed because the organization actually found their mission fulfilled. And at that point, they had to decide whether to go out of business or do something new. We've talked about this a little bit, but I just want to reiterate. Financial stability is about understanding the numbers. It's about having the systems in place to monitor what's going on from a financial perspective, understanding trends. And remember, not-for-profit is a tax status, not a business model. If you lose money on every widget, that means you got to go raise money to keep delivering the widgets. And by the way, a widget might be a unit of service of a person. And you need to understand liquidity. The new accounting rules and regs are going to require that every nonprofit provide the amount of liquidity that they have at the end of the year to fund operations for the next year, starting in probably 19 for most of you. Think about that. What your funders are going to see is whether or not you're living hand to mouth and you have 5% of what you need or you have 100% of what you need. And that's important to funders. Funders want to know whether or not you are financially sustainable. And so you've got to be able, as a board member, to think about this and think about how do we become financially sustainable. Here's an interesting slide that I would share with you. This is a made-up higher education division. But I want you to take a look at these numbers because part of being a board member is asking for information in a way that you can understand what's going on. So look at the left-hand side. That's the zero budget approach. We brought in revenue and we spent it all. Actually, I did a presentation the other day with somebody who is a CFO of a major foundation funder, and they said anybody who shows us a zero-based budget, we will not fund because we know something is a plug number. And what you really need to understand here is that it is okay, by the way, to show a margin because a margin is what helps you build systems and it helps you provide liquidity cushions and it helps you think about how do I provide financial stability for the future. The right-hand side is what I like to call the operating margin approach. In this case, it says what's really the amount of money that we get through delivering our products, our services, in this case education, and what do we spend it all? And oh, by the way, we lose $9 million a year. These are in thousands. We lose $9 million a year doing that. So it means we need to raise $9 million, right? Wrong. You actually have to raise 12 because you got to pay for the amount of money that it takes to raise money. And if you aren't thinking about your development staff and your development efforts as an investment, you need to start thinking about that. Every board I've been on, I have advocated for spending more money on effective development. But effective development means that you have the benchmarks and you have an understanding of what you're expecting people to raise. And then they're able to help you get there to those goals and objectives. On programmatic sustainability, you need to constantly make decisions that are in line with your mission. It is critical for the board to understand program performance, which, by the way, probably includes numbers, but it is not only financial numbers. What are the key performance indicators that are helping you understand whether or not your programs are successful? So, for example, if we are looking at an institution of higher education, one of our key indicators might be the number of academic credit hours we deliver. But what happens if only 50% of our students are graduating? Is academic credit hours delivered really the number we want to look at? Something's going on that student is not getting what they need to get to graduation. If you think about, for example, hospitals have government-defined indicators that they have to monitor, both in terms of meeting just clinical standards, but also how can they tell what quality of care is. As a board member, you need to know what it is that you can use to monitor the mission performance of programs, and you need to be able to add and subtract programs based on that assessment of the programs over time. So let's take a minute and talk about a few case studies. Once you're on the board, what happens if? March of Dimes. Many of you probably know this story, but the March of Dimes was originally started to eradicate polio. I don't know how many of you have known people that have had polio. I've had several very dear friends who were polio survivors. Polio was devastating in the early part of the 19th century. High mortality rate for children and adults that got it suffered lifelong consequences. There's actually something called post-polio syndrome that people lived with forever. And so the March of Dimes set out to try to figure out how to eradicate this disease. And guess what? Vaccines came along, and polio was ultimately eradicated here in the United States. The organization could have folded up, but instead it changed its mission and its vision. And if you actively look on their webpage, this is from their website, you can see that the organization as it was founded looked at the personal struggle of a president. He's the one who helped organize this group, and he's the one who helped provide its mission until the vaccines were created. At that point, the board could have said, we're not going to do this anymore, and we're going to find another purpose for our residual assets. But instead, they moved to preventing birth defects, and you can read that here on the screen. Many of you may be in communities across the United States that have another great example of this. My background industry specialty, as Eliza told you, includes healthcare. When I first started working in the healthcare industry, there were many, many independent 501c3 hospitals. Over time, those have almost all been purchased or merged into other 501c3 organizations or bought out by for-profits. In almost all cases, there was some type of cash payment made to the community. And what you will actually see in many communities now is a health foundation that has been formed with the proceeds from the sale of the hospital. Those residual assets are used for the benefit of the whole community, and that foundation actually works in most cases to benefit the health and welfare of the residents of the community that the hospital was in. In fact, if you live here in Williamsburg or you come back to campus, you will be interested to know that there actually is a Williamsburg Community Healthcare Foundation here that was generated as a result of the sale of the hospital. So what you can see is that while this might seem far-fetched and you go on a board, there actually are times when the mission and vision change to such a degree that you have to completely rethink them and reposition an organization. A second thing that might happen is you might have an organization that gets into very deep financial trouble. Goodwill Industries of Southern Nevada has been in the newspaper over this past year for going into bankruptcy. Now, I am not familiar with what actually happened in this specific case in terms of knowing the management team or knowing the board. But I can tell you that the press articles are not flattering. Now, the press articles are also fair in that they are saying that this particular organization suffered from many of the external trends that are battering regular retailers. Think about what's going on in retail today. The issues of dealing with brick and mortar versus online sales. The issue of having to make higher level payments to retail employees. The issues of consumer financing for purchases. As you know, one of Goodwill's major sources of revenue comes from their thrift stores. And they were suffering from some of the same headwinds that were there for other retail organizations. However, if you look at this particular extract that comes out of the newspapers, what you'll see is that they had to bring in new management to actually streamline processes, think about liquidity, and figure out how they could be survivable going forward. Goodwill, by the way, has a very good name. They have some really, really strong chapters across the United States, and they have a terrific mission. I don't know if in this case it was a management issue or an environmental issue or a combination of both. But what you can see is that that board had to take some very tough decisions under consideration before they actually moved into bankruptcy and reorganizing so that they can survive into the future. The third one is LifeSpire of Virginia. LifeSpire of Virginia actually runs not-for-profit or continuing care retirement communities. They experienced some very negative financial results, which are available in the bond analyst reports if you follow public bonds. When the long-term CEO retired, the new CEO got brought in with very specific requirements around operational and financial prowess. And now they are underway with significant operational and marketing improvements, as well as repositioning the communities. They will do 2 major financings this year, and here's an interesting chart. If you look down under profitability ratios, the median for their competitors is about a 10.4% net operating margin. What you can see is that in 2015, this particular organization had a negative 2.1. In the second quarter, they were at 7.1% operating margin with no change in business model. So what you can see is that paying attention to the basics, paying attention to the finances, and benchmarking in order to understand what you as a board member should expect is critical. So let's recap. What did we talk about today? We talked about the fact that not-for-profits are corporations. We talked about the fact that the board performs the governance function for those corporations, and they do it focused on public good or for public benefit. As a board member, you're part of a team. It's your responsibility to understand the role and to carry it out. And also, by the way, it's your responsibility to do the appropriate due diligence before you go on the board so that you feel good about it when you get there and you're happy and excited to be a board member. But once you're there, while you're going to have a lot of fun things to do, you also have to realize you're running a business. And not every business runs smoothly all the time. But think about it. Where would we be without all those nonprofits? Where would we be without that 5+% of GDP? And where would we be without nonprofits that are employing so many of the people who bring value to our world? Thank you for being here today. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Eliza.
Thank you so much, Susan. I've heard many conversations about not-for-profit boards in my lifetime, and so often they're superficial and kind of dusted and powdered sugar. So this has been really wonderful to have a deeper dive and understanding into what that means. And I think, as you pointed out at the end, the economic impact that these boards have on the country is significant, not to mention the social impact. So thank you so much. This has been wonderful. Keep typing in questions if you have them. We'll keep it open for a minute and maybe take some of the questions offline and send them out in the email. As Susan said, we will send the deck and the recorded webinar to all of you who attended. And I hope this is helpful to those of you who are currently on boards or look to become a board member. Thank you so much. And thank you, Karen, who's making sure our technology was going along swimmingly. Take care. Have a wonderful rest of your day.